Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 18 cheat sheet. We have a very quick midweek fixture arising upon us. We also probably won't have too much information, unfortunately, with the pressers and things, specifically over the Saka injury. My estimate for him, given that he's sort of such a big piece within the game that so many people own, is that he's probably going to be out for at least 2 to 3 weeks. And I think 2 to 3 weeks is a timeline, if I'm using that as a horizon, where you can say he's probably going to miss out on 3 fixtures in FPL. I suppose the best case is that he comes back in time with 1 to 2 game weeks of time, right? And that's going to have a very significant impact on how we plan in FPL, because it probably means if you think that he's missing the Ipswich at home game, that there's so many good midfield picks right now to move off to, that this is probably a good time to actually jump off of Saka, knowing that he's going to miss out on at least 1 game. But you can make predictions about how good some of the other assets within the field are, specifically within Arsenal, around this injury. So those are my sort of initial thoughts. Jumping quickly into the cheat sheet, if you've never seen it before, it's a series where I rank all the different positions in the game based on what I sort of see as their efficiency, given their price point. And the biggest change so far has been in the budget mids. I think we've seen enough of the budget mids. I have to make a lot of comments on them because I've made so many changes. Going with Ahmad first, I still think he's a great pick. I have no concerns over him. I like the fact that he's on corners now. Rashford effectively exiling himself from the team is just going to be a natural plus to him, because he's going to play in more offensive positions going forwards. He might still play right wing back, but that just means that he's got really good minute share. He presses a lot for the team, which is what you want as a modern manager, I would say. And it means his position in the team, I feel, is locked compared to, let's say, someone like Garnacho, who is more of a player on the periphery, or let's say even like Højlund or Xerxes, where they're competing for minutes. As far as Rodgers, the reason why I've given him a rise is because I was really impressed with the performance with Aston Villa, specifically with the holding pivot of Onana and Kamara. I think that's potentially what they can work with going forwards, and Rodgers' baselines have stayed really solid. His minutes have been really good, and I think arguably he is actually the best player on the team from an offensive point of view. You might want to say Duran, because Duran's clearly playing so well that he's been, sitting a very top level player like Watkins right now on the bench, and I think that comes down to the level of Duran. But I think Rodgers, in terms of the ball carrying, in terms of also sort of now his attentiveness in terms of making actions within the box, he's just a really good player. I think, yes, the next 2 fixtures aren't very good. Brighton actually looks a lot better. We've been talking about Brighton and they're changing baselines recently. I think Rodgers is still going to be a great pick. But Semenyo and Sarr for me are still wonderful too, and their underlying stats and their minutes, which are still slightly better than some of their peers in terms of the last 4 or 5 games, are just astoundingly good. Sarr, I think, benefits more so from, if one of, let's say, Eze or Kamada is out of the team, that means the minutes are very much secure, because Nketiah, is really going to be a substitute for, let's say, Mateta. And it's more likely you'll see less of Sarr to Nketiah as a substitute, which happened, I think, around 3-4 game weeks ago. And Sarr's baselines are really good. His fitness is really good. I think that he's a very key part of the team. He's also scored some great goals recently. And so I think, yeah, he's one of the top picks right now in a budget position. I have no doubts around this. I also wanted to talk about how I would actually plan to rotate around these players. I think that the rotation between Rodgers and Sarr actually looks really good, and the rotation between Ahmad and Semenyo looks really good. Semenyo has been given a rise because that knock that we were talking about last week seemingly was completely bogus. He's fine. So as soon as he comes back to being an 89-minute player, he's just going to be a really good pick in the game. And so I think when you look at, for example, the outputs this season, he's just been unfortunate that he hasn't really produced so much, right? Compared to, let's say, an Ahmad or some of the other picks who've done a little bit better in terms of performing closer to their underlying baselines. And I think that there's nothing in me that suggests that Semenyo is a really poor player. So I think that he's just going to be a really good pick going forwards, and I have no issues with him. With Enzo, I think he does get a drop. The issue is with Lavia out, he just plays a deeper role within the team, and that just makes him a worse FPL asset. So until basically Lavia comes back and kind of sits Gusto out for certain minutes of the game, or even for large portions of the game, then Enzo, I think, is going to be just a bit of a worse pick overall. As far as Kluivert, he's benefiting from Bournemouth having a lot of injuries, and it seems like the team plays itself, right? Like Ouattara, Semenyo, Evan Nilsson, and Kluivert. So because of that, I think his minutes are really strong. Just need to recognize that he's a penalty taker, and also that his NPXG is awful in terms of the NPXGI aspect of things, but a lot of it is penalties that aren't reflected within non-penalty stats. So it's justified. Whereas with Iwobi, I've given him a drop because you're 1 game off of one of the best fixtures in town, which is Southampton away, or rather at home. And I think they looked really flat in that game. But Fulham, their sort of saving grace this season has been how good their defense is, not necessarily their offense. And even though he has really good minutes, the underlying stats do suggest he's not a pick that is as consistently good as some of the other elite green picks. In the next sort of tier with the 6.x's, I've given Mitoma a drop. I think that, you know, you're coming off of a few good fixtures for Brighton. He might still have a great game versus Brentford at home because it's a really good game, but I think that there's just nothing really justifying his price point right now. So he gets a drop for me. Kulusevski gets added to the sheet. Brennan Johnson's minutes have been really poor. His minutes have remained really, really good. And Kulusevski's production has also taken a step up. And I'm just taking notice, right? The fixture in the immediate term in Game Week 18 isn't very good. So I would say Kulusevski is more of a buy for Game Week 19 plus. But once again, it goes back to the point that I think some of those green picks in the budget position are even better than Kulusevski. As far as the 7.x tier, this is a big question mark, right? Jota gets a rise, but I still think you're playing a huge guessing game here with his minutes. First of all, Darwin has played reasonably well in some of these sort of dead rubber games where, let's say, he's been able and allowed to play. On top of that, Luis Diaz has been amazing within that recent match, and even though he's, I think, struggled a bit for form, it seems like Slot also really likes when you see, for example, in a big game that Diaz is the one who's entrusted with the start in the center forward position, and Gakpo continues to play left wing minutes. I think that makes it a tricky landscape to justify going for Jota when you might be moving out of Saka. If you're, let's say, moving out of Mbeumo, I think it's a different pick because it's a different quality of pick, a different price range where you can sort of access, and Jota is quite nice in that. You might be able to get the hauls, right? The production of Jota has been great. He's been a really positive finisher for a long time now. And I would say, once again, if you can get the minutes right and you think he's going to play really good minutes going forwards, then he's a great pick. But I just can't justify that. I think there's going to be games within the distance here where you have so many fixtures in between them that he's just going to be rested for. And that's probably not good enough for me in FPL to say that he's a green pick. For the other picks, you have really good minutes, but I would say middling fixtures. So that's why no real changes on, let's say, a Bowen, Gordon, and Mbeumo. Bowen might be someone that I would actually drop after the Southampton game because, as I said previously, a couple of weeks ago, you're still going to have to deal with those Liverpool-Man City fixtures the same way that Mbeumo will deal with them soon. As far as Maddison, he gets included in the cheat sheet. A lot of people have talked about Maddison. I have to say, he's one of those players that I find really strange to discuss. It's not... Yes, Maddison is someone who is a positive finisher. He's always been regarded as one of the better finishers within the footballing world. I've seen data studies of finishing going back multiple years, and Maddison has always rated really highly there. I still think that Maddison is a bit of an overrated pick because when we look at these non-penalty numbers, when we look at these goal production numbers and goal assist production numbers, it still ultimately is based on a per 90, right? These are per 90s. He doesn't play 90 minutes a game. He can be an early sub. He can be coming off the bench. A lot of things have fallen really well for Maddison this season to allow him to get 9 goals, which I think is, of course, extremely impressive, and that's why he's a top 5, top 6 player within the game. But I find it very hard to justify recommending him as a pick because at any point in time, I think he's much less important to the team than Kulusevski, and it's really between Brennan Johnson and for him to lose minutes within games where Tottenham actually care about them. So I find it very hard to justify Maddison, and even though he's produced so well, I just don't think he's going to continue producing at such a ridiculous rate, right? No one really performs that consistently with such few minutes. And I'm expecting a little bit of a reversion to the mean, but even still, with the average expectation for Maddison being a good finisher and a really high quality level creator, the minutes still for me are not good enough for me to justify him being a pick. He might rise to being a yellow next week because the fixture simply, but I still find his minutes to be a huge issue, and I'm not going to be someone who's going to consistently recommend Maddison as a pick, and that's just my decision. I'm not telling people that they're going to be bad for going for Maddison. That's not the case. It's just that I find it very hard to, I guess, justifiably pick Maddison other than he's scored a lot of goals lately, because that's the thing. You can kind of point out a lot of players that get a lot of points, but it's also about projecting into the future and thinking about what's a reasonable case going forwards. Are they going to maintain this ridiculous spree, which I don't think is really reproducible at times, versus are they going to kind of perform closer to their baselines and maybe overperform slightly as they have, historically. So my thoughts on Maddison are that. In the next tier, I think Odegaard has suddenly become a better pick again. And we can see, as we mentioned previously, that his numbers aren't very good in terms of the NPXGI aspect of things. However, he now has the added benefit of getting access to potentially penalties for the next few weeks and corners, right? If you look at Saka and the production this season, specifically with Arsenal, those corners have been absolutely crazy. And I can see a lot of corners going towards Odegaard's way. They like their in-swingers at Arsenal. They take 96% in-swinging corners. Odegaard is your left-footed man who should be able to do the job. And that's why I think there's a lot of upside right now in being able to maybe go for Odegaard. But the strong, stable, long-term move is definitely Bruno. Odegaard has simply not really produced that much in open play, and you have much more faith in Bruno, but I think the fixtures for the next 3 definitely favor Odegaard. So For a lot of managers, even with myself, you are going to be dealing with a decision where if you're looking for a Saka replacement, this is it. It's probably between one of these two players in terms of stable minutes, generally good idea and rationale for going for these players. And so I like both of these picks. For me, I think I might go for Odegaard because I'm an aggressive manager. I like the short-term upside, and I'm probably going to be there. But I'd also, if you plan to go to Odegaard, understand that you might want to go back into Bruno, and you need to save a free transfer in 3 game weeks' time to actually go towards Bruno in game week 21. As far as the next tier of players, I still think that Foden's minutes could be a little bit variable because it kind of, I think, is also slightly KDB dependent. Currently, Foden has played a lot of minutes, but the production just hasn't been there for him this season. I think the baselines for the team have dropped. It seems like his underlying stats are still okay, but keep in mind last season, the reason why he was very much a good pick at that sort of price point that he is at now still, even though he's gotten a lot of price drops, is because he was overperforming his finishing. So unless you're suddenly expecting a complete U-turn in terms of that sort of, I guess, performance, you're also backing maybe into the next 3 fixtures, which are really good for Odegaard. But keep in mind, Everton are actually a really good defensive team, so it's really 19 and 20, which is the banker. So I don't mind Foden so much based on minutes, but I still think that, you know, ultimately his baselines just aren't good enough. And Son and KDB, their baselines are better, but their minutes are much worse. And that's why Son only gets a rise. He gets a rise really by proxy of Saka being out, and actually the Newcastle, or rather the Tottenham fixtures actually being much better, I guess, compared to, let's say, a Bruno, for example, because if I had to compare the fixtures, he just has a slightly better run of things compared to a Bruno, but is probably less of a good long-term pick, I would say. And he also has Arsenal way in the distance. So that Game Week 21 game is not great if you own, let's say, multiple Spurs players. And if I really had to pick a Spurs players right now, I would go straight to Solanke in terms of attacking positions. And you kind of need to think about the impact of how you're playing around your 7/8 players within the game. And on Palmer Salah, no comments there. Move on to the forwards. Right now, we have Duran being added to the cheat. We have Raul and Vardy as well getting a drop. And Duran is still, I think, extremely volatile and risky pick, right? His numbers are obscene, and it seems like he's actually getting more minutes than the classic 60-minute substitution. I've removed Watkins from the cheat sheet, but I still think there's a lot of risk associated to going to Duran, even though he's such a good player, and honestly could even be on penalties, I suppose. If let's say the decision-making was for Watkins with a really, really bad penalty record to be the penalty-taking player of the team, and Duran suddenly is playing really well, I think there could be a world where you can suddenly see Duran being on penalties even if Watkins is out, and so that could be a huge plus for Duran. As far as Raul and Vardy, the fixtures aren't good enough for Vardy, and the minutes just aren't good enough for Raul. I'll probably put my hands up and say I was actually quite high on Raul at the start of, you know, when I recorded my transfer plans video, and then actually by the time I recorded my team selection, which was a little bit later than my cheat sheet, I saw the midweek quote that Late Riser had posted on Twitter, which had Marco Silva talking about how both the strikers were in a good moment. And then actually we got some embargoed comments yesterday on how Muniz and Raul might be preferred for different tactical setups. So it kind of gave me an indication that potentially what might happen is Raul could be someone that Marco Silva intends to play versus the tougher teams. I still think you'll probably get the Ipswich fixture because the rotation comes right before a FA Cup match where I think Muniz could play. So Raul isn't an absolutely awful pick, but he definitely gets a drop if you're such a good player and you actually are capable of missing out on some key games. It might be also interesting to see whether there's going to be a change to this, right? Because this sort of rotation of Raul to Muniz didn't work out for Marco Silva. They didn't get the result. They should have really gotten 3 points versus Southampton if you look at expectations on paper. And that could change things going forwards for Raul and Muniz. But I wouldn't also completely attribute the poor performance of Fulham entirely to Muniz. So it's hard to see what will happen going forwards. But we also know that Raul at his age will lose minutes going forward. So missing out on Southampton at home game is just crucial in terms of how we evaluate him as a player. In the 6.x tier, I think Jesus just becomes an amazing pick. I do recognize that it's really 4 players, 3 positions. Your question is probably going to be, does Jesus play more the right wing position versus Martinelli? And does Jesus play more the center forward position versus Kai Havertz? With Rice coming back into the team, it means it's harder to kind of throw Havertz into a center mid type position. And I think that does sort of dampen Jesus. So I do think that Jesus has an asterisk to him where he's got the form, right? If you can ever pinpoint a time where a manager is going to play a player because he's played well recently, it's now with Jesus. And it's really nice that it's now because you'll get Ipswich at home. So I like Jesus from that aspect. But I do think that he could be a very short-term punt, and he could even be a good medium-term punt depending on how long Saka's out for. And it also depends on, let's say, the performances of Trossard and Martinelli and how well they're also able to hold up their positions respectively on, let's say, the left and right flank if they get to play there. I think right now Jesus will get starts, and I think that's why he's going to be a really good pick. but once again, a short-term expiry date potentially. Evan Nilsson is someone that I've dropped a little bit because I still think those early substitutions do bite into him a little bit. The fixture run is slightly worse too, so that's why I'm going to give him a soft drop. When you compare to, let's say, someone like Wood, I think I'd much rather a Wood who's on both penalties and also has pretty good underlying stats anyways. In the next tier, I've given Solanke a rise, even though the next fixture is Nottingham Forest away. He did really well in the Liverpool at home fixture, and it just shows you, I think, look, if there's anything that you can really evaluate this Tottenham team on, it's the simple idea that they're one of the best offenses within the league. They're still inferior compared to Liverpool. That's absolutely true, and their defense is absolutely awful right now. But Solanke benefits from that, right? His underlying stats are really, really good. He is far and away the best player within this price point, and I think that remains the case, especially since I don't think that Havertz is going to take penalties over Odegaard. As far as Cunha and Mateta, what I would say with these players is, look, Cunha is only here until he gets banned. I don't know when he gets banned. It might be Monday. It might be after Christmas if people want to work, or I suppose want to decline working up until then. But the Wolves fixtures just aren't good enough now. And probably after this Man United game and that Tottenham game, it's just a really poor run overall for Wolves. And I think Cunha has done incredibly well over this run. He's shown to be an absolute bonus points superstar. I was going to say merchant, but that's actually disrespectful to him. But he was probably going to get banned soon, so could be sayonara for him on the cheat sheet. With Mateta, I think it's more about seeing out this Bournemouth away fixture, seeing what his minutes are going to be in the Game Week 18 match, and seeing whether it's likely for him to start Southampton at home. I don't know whether there's going to be rotation. I do think that Mateta is a pick that could be slightly overrated because even though he's on penalties, his underlying stats are poor. So when you compare to, let's say, someone like Wood, who actually has slightly worse fixtures, I guess the question always is going to be whether you need to spend that sort of level of money for Mateta when he probably is more of a minutes risk than Wood. Over the next three players, I've given Haaland a soft rise. This doesn't mean much because I still think that Salah, Palmer, plus someone else is clear, but with Saka breaking away, unfortunately, with his hamstring, it probably seems like Haaland could find his way back to some teams. I don't think I'd necessarily recommend Haaland because I like the next three fixtures potentially. Probably not as a captaincy in Game Week 18, considering how good Salah is, but there could be an option there, of course. My only issue with Haaland is it does feel like a move where you're going to be spending so many free transfers to move out of him. I don't think that he's necessarily a great pick for now. And with Jackson Isak, I think they're still very, very good. Jackson, clearly, once again, you have to kind of look at him with a little bit of a different expectation because he does play less minutes compared to a lot of his peers. I think that one of the big concerns is if he let's say starts versus Fulham at home, there's a possibility that he could be rotated versus Ipswich. So do keep that in mind when you're making picks between, let's say, Solanke, Isak, and Jackson. I have always preferred Solanke and Isak, and I'll stand by that. As far as the defenders, moving on to that, I've given Castagna and Anderson a rise. I think both of them should be coming back to playing very, very soon. So that's a huge plus for both players. Castagna played reasonably well after the first 15 minutes of diabolical passing from him and sort of mispossessions. But he made a close mistake to the end of the game. But the simple reality is they have no one else to play. So I think he's just going to get a lot of minutes, and I think he's just really worth it at his price point. With Anderson, same thing there, but sort of no risk, I guess, of rotation at all. He should be playing going forwards for Fulham, and he's just an upgrade over Issa Diop, I would say, for now, as long as he's fit to play. With Spence, he gets a drop because that Spurs defense just looks shocking. No changes really in the budget tier. In the next tier, though, we get Munoz getting a rise because he's now unsuspended. They did give away a lot of goals versus Arsenal, but I think that is Arsenal. And I'd also say that the expected goals within that game was a little bit unfair to how many goals that Crystal Palace have conceded recently. They are a little bit chaotic in the sense that I think that they play in a very aggressive manner, regardless as a team. So not exactly conducive for clean sheets, but we also know that Munoz is an incredibly insane attacking threat. And he might be one of those picks, once again, where you're saying that the justification for buying him is purely the offensive means of production for him. As far as the rest of the cheat sheet, no real changes there. I'm pretty happy with where players are at. Credits once again go to the Nottingham Forest defense that have looked so good for the season. I've always liked Aina over Milenkovic, and it's nice to see him score a goal as well because Milenkovic has had some pretty good goals going for him recently. Nothing really to separate a lot of these players within these tiers, in my opinion, because it's all about the way you rotate through these players. I can't tell you what's the optimal rotation for all these players here because it really just depends on what your third, fourth, and fifth defenders are, or whether you even have a premium defense at all. And ultimately, as long as you're able to field out three players with reasonably good fixtures based on whether they're playing home and away, good quality offensive opponents, that's really how you can optimize defense in FPL, and I would encourage you to continue doing that because I think that's the best way of playing with defenders. As far as the sort of premium price tier, I've given Cucurella a bit of a soft rise because I think coming back from suspension, his baselines have been really good. I still really like him as a pick, and I still think his minutes are going to be better than, let's say, a Malo Gusto. In the next tier, I've given Guardiola a rise, Saliba a fall, and that's simply because I do think that Arsenal after the Ipswich at home fixture could actually be seen as a little bit of a sell going forwards, whereas Guardiola actually has 3 really good games in a row, and he's shown that he has incredible offensive production. So I just wanted to kind of equivalate those players, whereas I think Gabriel is still probably the clear pick for me, and Alexander-Arnold, the absolute king of this position, I would say, but just clearly hasn't gotten the point so far. For me, I am so desperate to get Trent into my team. He looked absolutely incredible versus Tottenham, and I just think, once again, there's nothing for me to have changed my opinion on how good Trent is as an FPL asset. I know he hasn't produced points, but I just think that so consistently you see that underlying stats will convert into real points, unless it's DCL. But he is one of those picks with the great defense that Liverpool have in place and better fixtures and that sort of production all over the board with set pieces, with open play, madness like that cross to Luis Diaz. So that's Trent for you. And then in the goalkeeping position, I've made a lot of changes, and I think I've tried to reflect more long-term changes as much as possible. I'm beginning to feel that Sanchez is in a position where hopefully he doesn't get dropped in the future, but I still think he's one of the best picks because at that sort of price point, getting access to a Chelsea defense is just that good. I've given Sells a rise because they've kind of come out of their tougher fixtures, and I think he really deserves a rise back to the top. Fabianski gets a fall because I still think that West Ham defense is poor, and probably I need to sort of evaluate how you observe Fabianski as a pick. Some people are actually going for Fabianski as their sole goalkeeper. I think that's completely crazy. He's a very good deputy goalkeeper, right? With Kepa, Bournemouth has looked really good as a defense, and that's sort of a reflection of that. But keep in mind, of course, he does miss out on that Chelsea game because of the loan issue. As far as Pickford, with the Game Week 24 and Horizon and much closer now. And yes, of course, they've gotten clean sheets versus Arsenal and Chelsea. Pretty unlikely, but they've done it. At Goodison Park, where they've been an absolute fortress, the double is there again. And Pickford deserves a rise because of how good Everton have been as a defense. With a 4-star in Verbruggen, these defenses look absolutely awful, just reflecting that really within the cheat sheet. And with Onana, similar case as well. I think United just look like an awful set-piece defense. I don't really know how to characterize it other than they might be the worst set-piece defense in the league, but they're 10th in XGC rank for a reason. And I do think there has been a bit of a tilt towards more offensive style of play compared to shoring up defense under Amorim. Yes, of course, the open play expected goals conceded that people use with an extremely and exceedingly small sample size is relevant, but they still concede goals based on individual mistakes and set pieces, and that's still very real and reflected within football. So that's why Onana gets a drop for me, whereas I actually quite like, especially the Aston Villa holding pivot combo that they have and how that should bode well, hopefully, into the future, and generally speaking, how good Fulham have been as a team so far this season, whereas Alisson and Raya remain as the kings in this position. So that's kind of my thoughts in terms of the cheat sheet. Thank you guys so much for watching. Enjoy the Christmas time ahead, and I'll see you guys soon.